More on truth, theories and methods. Using critical thinking to evaluate arguments requires you to assess the truth of many different types of premises and claims. As you've already learned, it can be difficult to know with certainty whether a given claim is true. Over time, philosophers have developed different theories for understanding what makes something true or not. In this episode, you'll become familiar with 3 theories of truth used by philosophers, each providing its own framework for determining whether something is true or not. In addition, there are many different ways that people learn about the world, and in doing so, move closer to true knowledge of it. You'll also learn a little bit about the different ways people acquire knowledge of the world. 3 theories of truth. The truth of some premises is easily evaluated. For example, if someone tells you that they have a dog in their car, you can simply go to the car and look for a dog to determine if they're telling the truth or not. However, the truth of many other premises is not so readily assessed. If someone claims to be an expert cook or fluent in a foreign language, those claims may be true, but their truth is harder to establish. Many of the things we know or claim to know about the world are hard to verify. Philosophers have developed different ways of trying to deal with these more complicated potential truths. Subjectivism. One way of looking at truth is captured in the phrase, "What's true for me may not be true for you." This phrase illustrates subjectivism. Subjectivism is a theory of truth that says truth ultimately can be determined by an individual. Subjectivism is similar to relativism, a theory of knowledge that applies to moral and ethical beliefs. Relativism holds that morality is relative. What one person believes to be morally acceptable may be immoral to another person. Subjectivism applies the same approach to facts about the world. Each of us decides what is true. As you might expect, it's the opposite of objectivism. Objectivism sees the truth as independent of an individual. As a theory of truth, it's fairly easy to dismiss subjectivism. The idea that all facts are dependent on whether or not an individual thinks they're true seems unreasonable to most people. You may claim that you do not believe gravity exists, but most reasonable people would say that your version of the truth is wrong. Even though most people would reject subjectivism as a valid theory of truth, it pops up quite regularly in everyday arguments. Arguments based on the premise like, "What's true for you isn't true for me," or "The rules don't apply to me," are pretty common, but not logically valid. As you think critically about statements you hear or read, you should always be alert to when a subjectivist perspective on truth is being used in the arguments. Coherence Theory. Another way of evaluating the truth of premises is to think about the premise in the context of other things we know about. The coherence theory of truth says that something is true if it fits with other things that we know or believe to be true. For example, consider the argument that poverty causes crime. If we eliminate poverty, we can eliminate crime. One way to evaluate the premise, "poverty causes crime," is by looking for other factors that could lead to crime. Most of us would come up with a relatively long list of potential causes that might include things such as drug addiction, lack of moral upbringing, or ineffective law enforcement. So, the coherence theory of truth says that we can judge the truthfulness of a statement by examining it in the light of other things we know. Of course, one problem with the coherence theory is that it can lead us down a rabbit hole of sorts. If the truth of premise A depends on us knowing already that B and C are true, we might then ask how we know B and C are true. If we subscribe only to the coherence theory, we'll get stuck in an endless spiral of looking for other things that make the claims in front of us true. It can be hard to figure out where the ultimate foundation lies. What things do we know to be true solely on their own merits, rather than in a relationship with other claims? Pragmatism. Another way of looking at truth considers things from the perspective of the consequences of accepting them as true or not. Pragmatism says, in essence, if something works, then it's true. If we can accept the results or consequences of taking X to be true, then X is true. If we're okay with incorporating the consequences of something being true into our lives, then we can accept it as true. What if someone made the following argument? You can study for an exam too much. Once you've studied for about 4 or 5 hours, you should stop studying because you start getting the ideas confused. What are the consequences? What if you stop studying after 4 or 5 hours? Can you live with that not being enough? If you can't, pragmatism says consider it not true. As with the other theories you've heard, there are challenges with the pragmatist approach. How do we know what works? How do you know before you take the tests whether 4 or 5 hours is enough? There are many truths that may be difficult for us to assimilate into our lives, and yet we have to live with them. If we're having trouble figuring out how some aspect of the world fits into our life, does that mean it's not true? Or what if we're somehow unable or unwilling to accept that truth? How do we know anything? Another part of the puzzle of unlocking truth is how people come to know about the world. Whether you're evaluating a premise based on subjective and individual ideas, its relationship to other things we believe to be true, or whether it works in our experience, it helps to think about where the premise came from in the first place. What would make someone claim that all swans are white, or I'm sick, or the earth is round? There are many different ways that people develop knowledge and understanding of the world and of themselves. One idea is that we're born with certain ideas or innate understanding of the world. We simply know what is good or bad, beautiful or not, right or wrong. You've already learned about the problems of relying on innate knowledge or instinct as a way of arguing. This way of knowing cannot be subjected to reasoned, logical analysis, and thus is not an appropriate basis for making an argument. So let's say you tell a friend, "That painting is ugly." Your friend might ask, "Well, why do you say that? I think it's beautiful." If you were to reply, "No way! I just know beauty and I know that's not it," you should not be surprised if your friend challenges the claim and asks for some more considered reason. Another way that we develop knowledge is through experience. We see, we touch, we hear, we smell, and taste things, and in doing so, we learn about the world. We figure out whether something is hot or cold, soft or sharp, big or small, and so on. This approach is known as empiricism. Empiricism is a theory of knowledge that says people learn about the world through direct experience, using their senses to see, touch, taste, and so on. While this may seem like the obvious path towards true knowledge, there are two main limitations to relying solely on empiricism. First, even though we may have direct sensory experience of something, how we interpret what we've seen, heard, felt, etc. is influenced by ideas we already have about the world. So consider this very basic example. One sensory experience of the world occurs when we taste spicy food. But the concept of spicy is not clearly or universally defined. Food that makes one person exclaim, "Yikes! That's burning my mouth, it's so spicy!" might have someone else saying, "It's okay, but it could be hotter." Sensory experiences differ from one person to another, so what they know about the world differs. Second, it's simply not possible to directly experience everything about which we may want to know. When people wrestle with economic, social, cultural, ethical, and political problems, they're frequently dealing with ideas about how the world should be that cannot be subjected to scrutiny by our senses. Most of us will never visit the South Pole. We'll never experience what it's like to see nothing but ice as far as we can see, or know what it feels like when it's 40 below zero. As critical thinkers, we want and need to be able to say things about personal and community moral choices that cannot be resolved by trying to see, feel, touch, or smell. A third way that people develop knowledge is through the use of ability to reason. This approach is known as rationalism. Since we're not able to directly experience everything in the world, practically speaking, we can't see, touch, hear, or smell everything that exists, and there are some things that are not subject to our senses. But we can use our capacity for reason to gain knowledge about the world and then apply that knowledge to our experiences. Reasoning can come into play when we combine ideas we hold or have heard about the world with the experiences that we do have. Or we may use reason to work through problems that are not easily addressed by direct sensory experience, such as difficult ethical problems. Reason itself comes from a variety of sources. Direct sensory experience contributes to what we rationally know, as do personal beliefs, cultural values and ideals, scientific examination, mathematical and logical equations, and so on. As a critical thinker, you should strive to use as many sources of knowledge to help you evaluate and formulate arguments. As you can see, trying to establish the truth of an argument's claims is an important but difficult task. One way that scientists, philosophers, and others try to deal with that challenge is to try to determine if a claim is false, rather than trying to prove the claim is true. This is the difference between verification and falsification. If we can show X to be true, the claim is verifiable. If we can show X to be false, then the claim is falsifiable. In general, it's far easier to falsify a claim than to verify one. For example, is the claim that all swans are white. In order to falsify this claim, all we need to do is find one non-white swan. But in order to verify the claim, to prove that it's true, we need to somehow find every single swan that exists and see that they're all white. While it may be hard to verify some claims, if we can falsify them, then we learn something important about the argument the claim is part of and take steps to reject or improve the argument with alternative claims. It's important to keep in mind that falsification and verification are separate processes. A lack of falsification does not mean we have verified a claim. When someone says, well, you can't prove claim X is false, so that means it must be true, they're making a significant error in reasoning. A lack of counter-evidence, for example, if we haven't found a non-white swan, does not mean the claim, in this case, that all swans are white, is necessarily true. The black swan might still be out there, but we just haven't found it yet. Determining truth is essential to critical thinking. But knowing the truth is a challenge for a lot of important questions. It's unlikely that we're born with enough knowledge to determine the truth. And knowing the truth by either observation or reason both has its limitations. As we think critically, you have to keep in mind these limitations on knowing what is true.